Hazem Seeker. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Facebook's big data problem, how our information is being bought and sold without us knowing. Also this week, America's guns. We'll look at why this huge, unregulated market continues to thrive despite calls for gun control.
It is the largest deficit of any country in the history of our world. It's out of control.
Plus, the US president signs off on action against Chinese imports, potentially igniting a trade war. Our data is being hoovered from our connected devices every day. But when it emerged that that information could be used to manipulate our political views for money, regulators around the world started paying attention. It's called psychosocial profiling, and it's put Facebook and the whole business of big data in the spotlight this week. We all know that we can post things like photos and messages to our friends for free on social media. Now, Facebook makes money out of selling digital advertising space with an annual revenue that amounts to $40 billion. Over 1.4 billion people log on to Facebook every day, but we don't know what they're selling about us, and it's totally unregulated. Now, this week, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg had to answer accusations that 50 million users had their data harvested and passed on to a UK political consultancy. Cambridge Analytica is accused of using that data to target US voters during the 2016 election. Facebook's business model is now under scrutiny on both sides of the Atlantic. By Thursday, shares lost $50 billion in market value. Katia Lopez-Hodoyan reports.
Mark Zuckerberg doesn't like giving interviews, but the pressure on the camera-shy founder and CEO of Facebook was so great he had to do something. He told the American media he was sorry about the security breach that compromised the private data of 50 million Facebook users. In a statement, he acknowledged there were failures in Facebook's protection of data. "I started Facebook," he writes, "and at the end of the day, I am responsible for what happens on our platform. I'm serious about doing what it takes to protect our community. While this specific issue involving Cambridge Analytica should no longer happen with new apps today, that doesn't change what happened in the past. We will learn from this experience to secure our platform further and make our community safer for everyone going forward." Those steps include a review of all apps that had similar broad access to user data, further data restrictions, and making it easier for users to rescind permissions. Zuckerberg's carefully choreographed response to the Cambridge Analytica scandal is not what U.S. lawmakers are asking for. They would rather have him testify in person before Congress. Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar has formally asked for a judicial hearing. Zuckerberg says he's happy to testify before Congress if it's the right thing to do. He also says he's sure someone's trying to disrupt this year's midterm elections. Underlying the uproar, the allegation that data harvested from Facebook servers was used by Cambridge Analytica to support the Trump campaign in 2016. Interference in the electoral process confirmed in this undercover interview with the company's then CEO, Alexander Nix.
Have you met Mr. Trump?
Many times.
You have?
We did all the research, all the data, all the analytics, all the targeting. We ran all the digital campaign, the television campaign, and our data informed all the strategy.
A delete Facebook hashtag has been trending. But even if the bad publicity blows over, other troubles for the social networking giant are just beginning. The Federal Trade Commission has opened an investigation into Facebook. So too have at least 3 U.S. states.
Well, joining us now from London is Daniel Knapp, Executive Director for Technology, Media and Telecommunications with IHS Markit. Good to have you with us, Daniel. So let me ask you first off, are we looking at a possible watershed moment here, not just for Facebook, but for social networks and the whole issue of privacy?
I think you're exactly right. This is much bigger than Facebook itself. We have for decades now, nearly, let social media define how we get our information. It was designed by driven by computer scientists without really looking at the broader ethical and social implications. So with the recent Facebook scandal, with previous issues around brand safety and dubious advertising on YouTube, this is a much bigger thing where society is now trying to claim back control over social media.
So is this a wake-up call as well, not just to the social media platforms themselves, but also to users? I mean, do we just need to be more digitally savvy, more discerning about what kind of information we post about ourselves online?
It is surprising that it took the Cambridge Analytica situation to really make users aware. We've had these problems around privacy and third-party apps harvesting user data for many years. Many users will think back about to the Farm Times or other third-party apps that do personality tests and so forth. These apps have always systematically harvested personal data, and not just your own data, but also the data of your friends. So I think we're seeing this outrage right now because suddenly all these data harvesting practices that are commonplace in the industry are connected to political outcomes, to a controversial figure, to a controversial election in the US, and even to the Brexit campaign. So it is the conflation of data harvesting and the political implications which actually facilitate this wake-up call. But honestly, people should have woken up much earlier than this.
So does this threaten Facebook's whole business model then? Because the argument is that it is predicated on people giving up their data.
Facebook wasn't abused, to put this very clear, and this has been a kind of wrong in the narrative so far. Facebook has been used very effectively because what has been done actually is what Facebook was designed for, to target users with advertising better than what other publishers can do. However, speaking to the advertising community, there is currently no broad incentive to move ad dollars away from Facebook. There simply isn't another platform. There isn't another tool that allows advertisers to reach audiences at that scale. So the advertising industry will wait to see this storm blow over and continue to advertise on Facebook. The only thing that will enable Facebook to change its business model is if all big advertisers come together and enforce rigorously new standards on Facebook. Otherwise, after a couple of weeks, this will be business as usual.
Should users then get a cut of this money?
That's a big question that's being discussed widely in technology circles. We think about new techs like blockchain, for instance, which would enable users and consumers to be paid their fair share of money that they sell, basically, through their attention. However, it's pretty much still science fiction, so it's not something we're going to see realistically in the next 5 or 10 years. But there's a key role here to play for regulators, which we haven't discussed. And in particular, the European Commission now is in a very good position to tighten the screws on Facebook. They have been cracking down on platforms for a while now. And the new situation with Cambridge Analytica has opened the doors even more widely for regulatory scrutiny. So this, to me, is the biggest driver and the biggest impact that Facebook is about to change, and which is actually behind the stock decline that we see. It is the ability now for regulators to intervene.
You talk there about greater regulation, but Facebook is a platform that is available throughout the world, and there are different jurisdictions and different regulations in all of these countries. I mean, how do you deal with all of that?
The European Commission actually, with its new data protection policy, mandates every company that operates in Europe, that has European users, whether it's based in the US or anywhere, to adhere to those standards. Facebook and all large platforms want to unify the user experience, harmonize it across different countries. So if you have a large bloc like the EU pushing for tighter regulation, pushing for opt-in of data, for instance, pushing for clearer communication around how data is being used, it is fairly easy for Facebook and other platforms to deploy this globally. Now, there is, of course, a loophole. If you are an advertiser or a political influence firm based outside of the European jurisdiction, also outside of the US, you can still manipulate and misuse the platform. So we can't close all loopholes. through regulation. But what we can also do through regulation, on top of protecting users in many jurisdictions, is to change how platforms think about their users, adopt more rigorous ethical controls, and also, for instance, within Facebook, really ensure that with every programming and coding decision that is being made, the social implications are being considered too. And there has been a huge gap so far between coding the digital world and thinking about what that might mean for the real world.
Good to speak with you. Daniel Knapp in London.
Thank you.
Still to come on Counting the Cost, travel chaos in France as public workers begin some of the biggest strikes in recent years. But first, a call to action on one of the most contentious issues in American life today. Thousands of teenage activists are calling for tougher gun laws. Meanwhile, the CEOs of the biggest gun makers rarely give interviews and live lives far removed from the whole issue. But they're still profiting from the biggest unregulated gun market in the developed world. Well, the multi-billion-dollar US firearms industry has been largely shielded by the US Constitution, which allows people the right to own a gun. But in the wake of the hashtag Never Again, the investment community is also waking up to its role in the weapons economy. The calls have been growing as well for Wall Street to dump gun stocks. Fund managers, including BlackRock, have said they are having another look at their relationship with gun makers. And more than a dozen companies have ended partnerships with the National Rifle Association, the pro-gun lobby. The march in Washington is led by students from the school in Florida where 17 people were killed last month. Andy Gallagher reports on their journey to protest.
We'll take your name down, and if we have any extras, we can give you at the end.
In the weeks since this community lost 17 lives to one of the worst school shootings in US history, the push for change has been relentless. The March for Our Lives demonstration will be the biggest protest yet, and one led by the students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School.
You guys are the change that is going to be the tipping point to help that happen.
As they make their way to Washington to demand gun reform, many are excited about the global response to their cause.
Just to see the unity of our country and our world, because the march is now on all 7 continents, which I think is awesome. So I'm just glad to see that all happen.
We just want to graduate, spread love.
The national debate these children started has led to gun reform in Florida, but students say they won't stop until assault weapons are banned. It's an ambitious goal, but one organizers say isn't beyond this generation.
When someone underestimates you, you can come in from a position of power that they're not expecting. And that's really what's happening. So I'm just, riding the tide and watching, and it's awesome.
The fight for what campaigners call common sense gun reform will be long and difficult. Parents say the March for Our Lives protest is just the beginning.
They're very aware of what's happening in their surroundings, what has happened, and what they need to do. So we're proud of them speaking up and really taking charge.
Perfect.
In the hours before the march, the message from these students is simple.
I hope that this gets to every single person, as much people as we can, so we can finally make a change in this country.
Andy Gallagher reporting for us there. Well, joining us now via Skype from Raleigh, North Carolina is Jeffrey Moore, senior analyst with Global Risk Insights. Thanks very much for being with us. Now, just how lucrative is the gun industry in America? I mean, how tied are they into the whole economy there?
The gun manufacturers and accessory and retailers have a pretty sizable economic impact overall. It's about $50 billion directly and indirectly between gun manufacturers and retailers. You've got about $6.5 billion in taxes that are paid every year, and about 300,000 individuals employed either directly or indirectly through the gun industry. So it is a significant impact on America's economy, but relatively small compared to a lot of other areas across the spectrum. But it is a long-lived and established industry that likely won't be going anywhere anytime soon.
And from an economic perspective, how do you see where do you see the gun industry going under the Trump administration?
Yeah, well, we've got a curious situation where you had 8 years of President Obama, a couple of large, highly public mass shootings, and some fears that gun regulations were going to come down in a very big way. And that drove gun sales and ammunition sales through the roof, really, especially after 2012, the Sandy Hook massacre. There were fears from the gun lobby and from gun owners that they may issue those regulations and some bans in cases. And the revenues and stock prices for those gun manufacturers really, really went haywire to the upside, and continued doing that through the remainder of his presidency. The day after Trump was elected, the stocks of these gun manufacturers actually took a big hit in the days following his election, and have since come off pretty strongly. And the revenues have done this as well. There doesn't seem to be the political risk, the political fear that regulation will be coming down. And as a result, those have come off their highs, but also with President Obama and the feverish focus on whether or not he may do something to take guns away, may have pulled a lot of demand forward to those years. So you may see the gun industry enter a more natural ebb and flow of a business cycle from here on out.
One of the issues that comes to mind when you look at the economic aspect of this is this whole idea of ethical investments. Talk on Wall Street and among investors of pulling their money out of stocks that are directly or indirectly tied to the gun industry. Is that something that if it builds up could have an effect?
Yeah, that certainly could have an effect. And just yesterday, we had Citigroup announce that their Citibank operations for their commercial clients, they will no longer support commercial clients in the gun industry or the retailing industry of guns that sell guns of any kind to individuals under 21 years of age. So when you start having these commercial pressures from the banking and finance providers that give those services to the gun makers and the gun retailers, if they're going to be changing policies, much like the retailers have already started with Walmart and some other sporting goods stores raising that age to 21, you'll probably see a spreading effect of at least raising the age. So if things can't get done in Washington, you'll start to see private businesses take that own initiative to raise the age of purchasing guns.
Good to speak with you. Jeffrey Moore, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, interest rates in the world's biggest economy are headed higher. That was the message from the new chairman at the U.S. Federal Reserve this week. Jerome Powell, in his first Fed meeting, delivered a widely expected quarter-point interest rate hike, citing strength in the U.S. economy. He also hinted the path of rate rises could be more aggressive. And he warned U.S. trade policy might be a concern in the future. A day later, Donald Trump signed $60 billion worth of tariffs on products made in China. Kimberly Halkett has more.
Chinese President Xi Jinping welcomed U.S. President Donald Trump to China in November with an elaborate ceremony. Within hours, the two had signed more than a dozen business deals to showcase their economic partnership.
I view them as a friend. I have tremendous respect for President Xi.
So Trump's targeting of China with economic tariffs has left many bewildered. Trump's delivering on a campaign promise to rectify what he says is an unequal trade deficit favoring China of more than $375 billion. The list of Chinese imports the White House is targeting has not been made public. It's expected dozens of Chinese high-tech electronics and consumer goods, including apparel, will be affected. For years, Republicans and Democrats have been concerned about Chinese trade practices and theft of intellectual property. But there's division about Trump's solution to the problem.
Anybody reading the trade policy news on the business pages now probably suffers from a nasty case of whiplash, trying to decipher all that news. It is hard to identify a coherent strategy that will help American workers, businesses, and farmers when the dust settles.
As part of his announcement on tariffs, Donald Trump says he will renegotiate other trade deals he believes are harming the United States, including with the European Union, Canada, and Mexico. Still, his focus remains on China, the latest round of tariffs set to take effect in 60 days.
Now, China has hit back at those tariffs. Scott Heidler has the reaction from Shanghai.
Firing back, China responded within hours to President Donald Trump's announcement of the tariffs. Beijing said it's planning to impose $3 billion in tariffs of its own, targeting 128 U.S. goods bound for China, focusing on agriculture, wine, fruit, nuts, and pork products, but also recycled aluminum and steel pipes. This as China vowed it will not back down from a trade war, while insisting the friction should be resolved through negotiations. If the dispute continues, China says, it could damage the broader picture of cooperation between the world's two largest economies. It's telling the U.S. to pull back from the brink.
It's a destructive move. China and the U.S. are world trade leaders. I think it's going to escalate gradually. It will damage the economic relationship between the two countries, and that will have a negative impact on the global economy.
Both nations have said they're going to start legal action through the World Trade Organization. Here in China's commercial capital, Shanghai, there's growing concern over a trade war with the U.S. They're worried about jobs and they're worried about Chinese businesses.
It may affect employment in China, since exporting is a big part of China's economy. There's a lot of low-end industry, but many people's jobs are depending on export.
I watch a lot of news. Of course, China will fight back. The point of doing business is that we both win. It doesn't work if America is the only leader. China has to protect its own interests too.
The increased trade tension could prove to be a challenge for Chinese President Xi Jinping, who, by a measure passed during the National People's Congress earlier this month, can remain as leader indefinitely. A big trade war with the U.S. could slow China's rapid growth, critical to his long-term vision.
And finally, in France, presidents have come up against stiff resistance when trying to modernize the railways. Natasha Butler reports on whether Emmanuel Macron will succeed where others have failed.
Thousands of public sector workers protested in Paris, united in anger at the French government's plans to reform public services and cut jobs. It was a similar picture across the country. In the city of Nantes, there was some violence. Workers from France's National Railway, or SNCF, led the demonstrations. The government wants to scrap their special privileges, including early retirement for train drivers. But rail staff say the benefits are compensation for long, unsociable hours and low pay.
We must show that rail workers, like all French people, have to defend themselves. We want to show the power of the streets and that there are real people behind these jobs. So we are against Macron's plans.
We are certainly not better paid than others. Look at politicians and all their advantages. But they want to single us out. We don't agree with the changes, so we say no.
The SNCF has been in financial difficulty for years. It has $50 million of debt, and the government says that it must change to remain competitive, especially because under EU rules in 2020 the company will lose its monopoly.
Foreign rail companies will be able to run trains on the French network. The Prime Minister says SNCF must be prepared.
The world is changing. The SNCF must change with it. Faced with competitors, SNCF cannot remain the only company to recruit rail workers under a special status.
Created in 1938, SNCF is owned by the French state. It employs 140,000 staff. Past presidents have tried and failed to reform it, forced to back down in the face of opposition from France's powerful trade unions. Emmanuel Macron wants to be the one to succeed.
Macron may have more leeway because of a more general favorable public opinion in terms of reforming SNCF. I think people now are more ready to see something different.
The government says it'll reform SNCF by decree. That's put union leaders on the warpath. Thursday's demonstrations were smaller than expected, something likely to please President Macron. But with rail workers promising 3 months of rolling strikes, he still faces a test of strength.
So that is our show for this week. You can get in touch with us by tweeting me at @HazimSeeker and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you can drop us an email, countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Hazem Seeker from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.